So I'm not hearing any vetoes, so I'm just going to start talking. Feel free to ask questions during or after. I really don't mind, but I don't see you, so just interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm happy to discuss later. And this is also a topic that I'm kind of new to, as you will maybe see later. And I'm happy to discuss some of the points that I mentioned today also later in the discussion. Okay, so the topic I want to talk about today is open science and feminist psychology, and whether they are, in fact, a dream team or whether there are some barriers or challenges that we need to navigate. So how my whole interest in feminist psychology or feminist science started was actually on Twitter, as many amazing side projects that we do. So for one project, Maddie Pownell had a tweet asking for collaborators on her piece titled Navigating Open Science in Early Career Feminist Research. And later I did, together with Kohinoor Darda and Sarah Sauvé, a survey on feminist approaches to science as part of a SIPS hackathon. And out of these two Twitter tweets, originated actually two projects. One is already published, and one is being made ready to be submitted soon. And they are both about feminist approaches to doing science and the connection to open science. And this is what I want to talk about today and kind of present you these two papers in a bit more detail. So what I want to talk about today is how we as early career feminist researchers can navigate the world of science and open science. How can the goals of open science and feminist psychology inform one another and learn from another? What can open science offer us, and also what can we offer open science, and why should we incorporate a feminist view into the way we do science in general? But also, what do we need to be aware of, and what challenges and barriers exist in this combination of open science and feminist psychology? Just a little bit about positionality. So I am part of a collective of many feminist researchers who identify with the feminist ways of doing science. But we want to acknowledge that we all come from different so-called nation states, either as citizens or immigrants. We hold different gender identities. Some of us identify as racialized. So this is like a collective, and also the work I will be presenting today is kind of part of this collective group. So I wanted to make that clear. Where we come from, basically. And what we're using here is the academic wheel of privilege that has been published by the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training. It is currently undergoing a huge update, and hopefully the paper will be published or at least submitted this year as well in a preprint with an updated version of this wheel. So it's really cool. Have a look at the publication by El Sarif et al. If you are interested in that. I also want to start a bit about what is feminist research and what do we understand when we talk about that. So for us, feminist research aims to shed light on social structures and stereotypes that combat gendered inequality. So in a way, it is critical of patriarchal assumptions of traditional psychology and the dominance that they have in psychology until today. Critical of research approaches, methods, assumptions, how knowledge is being produced, how power is distributed, and accessibility issues. And all of this coming from a so-called intersectional perspective. So not only looking at sex or gender, but acknowledging that there are many types of inequality, many layers that we have to consider together. So as a collective, as the group, we embrace this intersectional approach. We recognize that who we are and what experiences we had influence our perspectives and our opinions. And we appreciate the benefits of open science specifically that can tackle and counteract inequality. But also we acknowledge that there are a multitude of factors which can also actually further enable or even restrict engagement in science and open science. And these we do not represent. And I will talk about both advantages and disadvantages of this connection today. So I already teased it a little bit. Once upon a time, me, Sarah, and Kohinor met at the SIPS last year. We ran an informal online survey of 105 participants, and then we hosted a hackathon on feminist practices on open science. We got quite a nice representation of different locations. So we had a lot of Europe, of course, but also other countries and other continents. We had a nice distribution of different career stages, which the majority were PhD students, but we also had postdocs, professors, and undergraduates, even people not working in research. And first, participants reported 3 associations that they had when thinking about feminist approaches to doing science. Because what we wanted to know first is what do people associate, what do people understand with feminist approaches? And then we asked them some questions about what they do, what their institution does in the field of open science specifically. So here you see a word cloud of what associations people had. And as you can see, we have the word feminist, we have women, so gender is kind of a thing that is very prominent for many people thinking about feminist approaches to science, but also things like inclusion, collaboration, sharing, opportunities, access, accessibility, voices, so empowerment, all of these very positive words. We have some negative things as well, maybe fight, broken science. So all of these things are kind of, what you could associate with feminist approaches to doing science. Around 70% in the survey replied that they actually did not know or were not sure what was meant by such approaches. And that was quite interesting for us, I think, because one goal of the second project in particular was also to educate people what feminist approaches are and what they can be, because not everybody knows that. And some of you might already be doing a lot of approaches that can be considered under this umbrella term, but you're maybe not aware of it. Around 22% indicated they are actually currently using those approaches in their own work, while 62% indicated that they would like to implement these approaches in the future. And in contrast to that, only less than half of the survey participants thought that their place of work would actually not like to implement the practices in the future. So it was kind of a half-half distribution. And this is also something we discuss in the paper, kind of the divide between what we can do as individuals and what the institution can do, and how this kind of works together. So the hypothesis I want to discuss today is that open science and feminist psychology actually have a lot of things in common. So they both have a fundamental concern to reappraise, rethink, and reconstruct norms of knowledge, power, and scientific inquiry. So wanting to be more critical, more inclusive, more open. So we could say that open science is actually a feminist thing. For example, open science puts emphasis on open access, which destabilizes power because we kind of democratize the access to knowledge by using open access. Everybody who wants to can have access to certain publications or data or materials. Open science is something that has been championed by kind of bottom-up grassroots initiatives, often made up from early career researchers. What open science does as well is it promotes working together, collaboration, and collegiality. For example, in the big team science approaches like many labs, many people from all over the world work together, which is inherently a feminist thing as well. Open science can also potentially mitigate biases that are implicit in academia. For example, the gender citation advantage. We now have things like the citation diversity statement or a citation audit, where we can look at how we cite in a certain publication, and we can kind of think more critically who we cite and how we cite. These things are kind of made more explicit in the process of open science then. And lastly, it encourages critical approaches to ideas that have so far been taken for granted or are kind of seen as status quo. The whole point of open science is to challenge existing structures, just as it is in feminist science. However, these power imbalances that are still inherent in every institution, in every lab, kind of make ECRs and also other groups vulnerable. So it is a bit complicated to think about these power structures and how open science doesn't really help, or maybe also makes that more, makes that even worse in a sense. For example, in feminist research, we often use qualitative or more creative approaches to do science. And so far, this has not really been accommodated by open science. Just as an example, there are a lot of templates for quantitative pre-registration, but none for qualitative research. Open science has also created very intense, I call it here abrasive and competitive online debates. For example, the Open Science discussion, which posits that open science conversations are still very centered around white, male, older people. And this is not something that should be the final goal. So to be truly open, we should be incorporating multiple perspectives and also voices by people who are maybe less heard. And lastly, there is still the problem of invisible labor that is not solved by open science, meaning that things that are being done in the background, caretaking of children or elderly, administrative duties, service duties, all of these things are rarely recognized, but they are being done, and this is kind of invisible. And I think open science and feminist psychology need to meet here and tackle these issues as well. So as an example, I also already mentioned open access, so accessibility of open science. For example, even though we publish open access, especially researchers in underrepresented or low to middle income research economies, sometimes also called the Global South, face different challenges of having the infrastructure, actually missing the infrastructure and access. Even though it might be available to us, it might not be available everywhere. This is also related to data sharing. For example, I recently got notified, or in a discussion found out, that some countries do not allow sharing certain kinds of data. So even if those people would want to incorporate open science into their work, they cannot, because it's legally not allowed. And this is kind of relating a little bit also the open science conversation, all of these challenges, to the so-called hidden curriculum. So this just means that there is a certain way of doing open science, but that is not clearly communicated there, but being judged. So there's not so-called plurality. So we cannot do open science in all kinds of different ways, but there's still kind of the one way, and it has kind of gone into a direction where we are not accepting of all the different ways that people could engage in open science and open science practices. So the question here is whether open science, as it is now, is actually really open for all. The second example I also already talked a little bit about is concerning qualitative research. So many open science practices have been developed for quantitative research, but these cannot just be readily transferred to qualitative methods. And so especially early career researchers who work in this qualitative space or in more creative approaches may be left behind because they cannot use these resources to do their work. Furthermore, research in the qualitative domain is often seen as less rigorous and therefore less fundable and less publishable. And this is a problem because it is actually not. It can be I recently did a workshop on qualitative data coding of interviews, and it is such a big field and such a promising field as well. And I think science and open science specifically need to recognize that these are two different ways of doing science that can coexist next to each other, kind of. So open science has the potential to benefit feminist early career researchers. So it can facilitate active, legitimate participation in academic spaces that might have previously been closed off to those who didn't have access to this kind of insider knowledge hidden curriculum. It has the potential. So examples I just mentioned here a little bit. We have the credit statement, we have inclusivity, employability, because open science practices are now more and more being recognized also in hiring procedures. We have collaboration with multiple groups, diversifying perspectives, being more accepting of multiple perspectives. And of course, these practical benefits are not exclusive to feminist early career researchers, can allow everybody to compete equally, kind of leveling the playing field a little bit. On the other hand, feminist ECRs can also benefit open science if we consider concepts like intersectionality and positionality. These can be incorporated into research work. So as I said in the beginning, for us, it's important to define where we are coming from, because this is very important to consider also the discussion and interpretation of the work. We can practice reflexivity and be aware of our motivations and actions, and also how those change over the course of the research process. Teaching and mentoring are really important hallmarks in feminist psychology and feminist science, and we can make a real effort in open science specifically to teach and mentor the younger generation in these values. And lastly, and this is kind of both coming from open science and from feminist psychology, we can think critically, and we can be less accepting of the status quo, the way things are now, and go more outside of our comfort zone into asking a bit more difficult questions sometimes. But as I mentioned, there are lots of barriers too. So especially in open science spaces, sometimes there is missing knowledge, hidden curriculum, things that we don't know, things are not clear enough. One example to counteract that is also by the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training. They published a glossary of open science related terms to kind of make everybody go on the same page when it comes to research terminology, because that can also differ per field. And so what they did is, I think, over 200 terms, 250 terms, defined by different people from the community. So you find things like p-hacking, salami slicing. This is from Parsons et al. In Nature Human Behavior, and it's a really, really cool publication. So please have a look. We still, I talked about this before, have these power imbalances that need to be navigated sensitively. And open science has this problem as well. And we have this problem not only, let's say, in terms of career level, but also in terms of location. So people who are in Europe, or maybe at a university that, for example, has a lot of access to paywall publications, paywall journals. It was like that for me in Vienna. I had a lot of access, and now I'm in a university that has less access. So even in Europe, even in developed countries where we don't have these bigger issues, there are still differences, and these imbalances need to be navigated, need to be addressed. I already talked about invisible labor and the perceived lack of objectivity and rigor of more qualitative and creative approaches. So a few others that I wanted to point out is that if we do open science, we kind of put ourselves on a pedestal as well, like we make ourselves quite vulnerable. And it has been pointed out that this can be actually quite scary, especially for early career researchers, for example, doing a pre-registration. They can be more readily scrutinized by others. So open science should actually kind of address that and say it's completely fine to make mistakes, to be a human, and but in fact, if we think about it, having a paper retracted or having to do a lot of deviations from a pre-registration does have personal and reputational consequences for you. And especially research that is being done from this feminist perspective is often more readily scrutinized or more specifically looked at and criticized. So when we talk about open science and encouraging openness as the new kind of status quo, going in that direction of being more open in psychological science, we have to consider what is being opened up and who has the power in this conversation, and kind of who is this governing body. And these things need to be considered and navigated. And here, this is also what I talked about before. It can not only be the individual's responsibility to do this, or to talk about this, to start these conversations, but it needs to come top down from the institutions. For example, looking at policy, hiring and career opportunities, service imbalances, the whole recognition system, what is being recognized, visibility, and so on. So I wanted to end with some practical things, because when working on these projects and writing these papers, we always wanted to end on a bit of a, what can you do now? How can you start incorporating feminist approaches into your science, into your open science work? So we wanted to give some practical tips. These tips are not necessarily specific to open science, but they can be applied in all kinds of science. But I think it is, even though some might seem a bit obvious, important to point them out, because maybe some people have not thought of them. So we came up with the first point, which is start at your own pace. There is not an all or nothing way to participate in open science. There is a lot of different ways. So if that is writing a pre-registration and then putting it in the drawer just for practicing, that is also doing open science. Or it is publishing a pre-registration and then having deviations and noting them down in the paper. So everybody can kind of choose their own way to start and their velocity at which they start doing open science. And I think that the overall goal is to do something, even if it is a little bit. But we also need to contextualize how we do open science in the current academic landscape, and how that can benefit, but also how that can harm us. And everybody needs to decide them for themselves, in their context, in their environment, what is good for them. We can engage in research advocacy. This is also related to teaching others, helping others, be a good colleague, collaborate, invite diverse perspectives, and be aware of those in your research. This is a bit related as well. So we gave the tip to be as open as possible. Sometimes it is not possible to be completely open. For example, if it's about sharing private personal data, or for example, qualitative work is often done in interviews and videos. Those cannot just be readily shared because they could identify people. So not all data maybe should be open, but we have to discuss what can be open and what should not be open. And lastly, or actually second to last, find your community in the local area where you are. So find a reproducibility journal club, or an open science organization like this one here, that gives regular talks and provides this kind of space for like-minded people to exchange ideas about all of these topics. And lastly, many ECRs maybe have not chosen their supervisor, and they have some problems with them. So here we try to give people the tip to consider their supervisor not as their only mentor, but that there are other ways for alternative and more diverse mentorship, that that people can branch out and ask other people in higher positions to give them input and feedback regarding their work. And for example, at the University of Vienna, we have these thesis advisory committees that not only involve the supervisor, but also involve an objective outside person and another person. So a little bit like you have a team of people who can give you input on your work and on your topics. And if you have any problems, of course, also talk about that. We are currently, this is just a teaser, in the second publication, also working on a top 10 easiest and most impactful feminist practices. So basically we came up with a bunch of practices, and then we ranked them in our group by difficulty and importance. And here you see kind of a bit the division. And on the right side, you see the overall topics that we kind of divided the practices into. And basically what we want to do is we want to have the top 10 easiest and most impactful, but then also provide the whole list of all the practices with their rankings in the upcoming publication. So I hope that, yeah, this is a little teaser for the hopefully soon to be published preprint. I also want to point out that at the German Psychological Association, together with the, I forgot the English name, DGPA, which is another association concerned with psychophysiology and its application, and also together with the Commission for Diversity, where Sören is a part of, we came up with these two checklists for conferences and events. One is for organizers of conferences and one is for participants, so presenters. And these checklists provide recommendations to promote the participation of members belonging to underrepresented groups and to increase accessibility, inclusivity in events like conferences. So they have a lot of interesting points that you can have a look at and consider maybe for your own next presentation. I put the QR code here, but I can also share the link later on. And those lists are really cool, I think, because they are timeless and we can always add to them if we have more ideas. So for everybody who's just waking up again now, I wanted to highlight that open science offers very important benefits to feminist early career researchers, but there are a lot of tensions still existing today that need to be navigated sensitively. And we do exactly that. We talk about these things at the Feminist Wonder Lab, which is a collective of feminist researchers that we founded last year at the SIPS hackathon. Here's the QR code for the Slack, and you can also write me later if you're interested in joining. So together we write papers, we discuss, we maybe are planning to do literature review soon. So we have lots of projects coming up. And if you're interested in joining after this presentation, feel free to contact me. And now I just want to thank all the amazing people that are part of the Wonder Lab and part of the two projects that I talk about, because these slides were kind of made in a collective way together, and I also got some feedback from others in the collective. I want to thank you all for your attention, and of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Thank you.